Hello, everybody. Um, I'm going to be presenting some preliminary thoughts based on some work that we've done in the Eastern Cape using isiMpondo, a variety of isiXhosa, to write some children's literature. And what I'm particularly trying to look at is if this variety is finding actually its place in schools, but also in communities. In some quick background, isiMpondo is a variety of isiXhosa. Then isiXhosa is the written standard variety. It is one of 11 official languages in South Africa. isiXhosa itself is spoken across the country. It's found in all provinces, but it's particularly concentrated in the Eastern Cape, the Western Cape, Free State, and the Northern Cape. The written isiXhosa is based on a variety of isiXhosa called isiChio, which was spoken originally in the west of the province of the Eastern Cape by essentially a small group of people in proportion to the rest of the isiXhosa speakers. And as you may know, the vast majority of speakers of isiXhosa or users actually of isiXhosa as a home language are actually more in the eastern part of the province. isiXhosa has a large body of literature going back to the 19th century. It is used as a language of teaching and learning in the early grades. It is taught as a subject right up to high school. It is also taught in universities as a subject, but also it is used to a limited extent as a medium of teaching and learning in some university courses and in some university programs. Some of the established varieties of isiXhosa include isiGcaleka, isiPaca, isiHlubi, and so on. But also isiXhosa has also several unnamed urban varieties. I'm going to come back to those ones towards the end of this presentation. The notion of eradicationism, actually, I borrow from Vuyokazi Nomlomo's work that she did in the early 90s, and she herself has borrowed this concept from Pride. And essentially, what Pride had in mind is practices by school teachers, editors, and other educated people to replace non-standard forms of language. So whether be it pronunciation, be it word use, or be it grammar with standard forms. So people tend to do this either in spoken language, but especially for written language. So these practices, he called them an attempt to erase or to obliterate non-standard forms. And eradicationism, these practices, they are regarded by those that practice them as a solution to the so-called problem of language variation. So people that regard language variation or language variance or language diversity as a problem, so they try to resolve it by eradicating these differences. Of course, inevitably, these kind of practices, even if it's unintentional, they often lead to linguistic loss by speakers of non-standard varieties, non-written varieties, but also to cultural loss of identity, but also it can cause many psychological and emotional problems for speakers of minority varieties. Okay, some quick background on the project. The children's writing project actually actually, to write in isiMpondo in particular was in fact an idea by the late Tessa Welch of Africa Storybook Project, which is a project of Sadie. And the work was funded by Xanax. In 2021, we sent out a call across the Eastern Cape, but also Gauteng and the Western Cape, via Facebook and other social media to prospective writers. And we aimed to reach aspirant writers, but also more established writers who were writing in isiXhosa, but also who had interest or skill or experience in writing in isiMpondo as well. Subsequent to that, we invited these writers to workshops, which were held in East London, in Bizana, in Lusikisiki. And from these workshops, we identified promising writers, which we followed up with face-to-face workshops or with one-to-one sessions that we did via telephone or WhatsApp and Zoom and so on to support them to produce some text in isiMpondo. And then through that process, we were able to produce 10 books in a variety of genres, which included original stories, but also retold stories, animal stories, folk tales, autobiographical and fiction, and faction stories, and a variety of varieties of isiMpondo actually were represented in those stories. Varieties from Bizana, Flagstaff, and Lusikisiki in particular. The stories, though, they were aimed at 7 to 10-year-olds. And based on the project, we are talking with colleagues in the Eastern Cape Pensalp group, colleagues at Fort Hare, but also some schools who have interest to write more books in isiMpondo, but also with people who are also trying to write children's literature in other varieties of isiXhosa that are found in the Eastern Cape. Okay, a very quick note on method of how we collected data for this specific presentation. We collected data from about 7 respondents, all of whom were writers in the project, and all of whom were speakers of home language speakers of isiMpondo. Of course, they also spoke and wrote isiXhosa as the standard form. 4 of the respondents were male and 3 were female. Their ages ranged from 31 to 51. 3 respondents were education district officials, subject advisors specifically. 1 was a teacher, another a social worker, and 2 were young community activists involved in the arts and language activities. And the data itself was collected via a semi-structured questionnaire, which took about 30 to 40 minutes long. It was transcribed in detail, and then we looked for some basic patterns in the data. So the rest of the presentation actually is based on the analysis of the data. Actually, it's very preliminary analysis, what we're learning about what people are thinking. And the specific focus of this presentation, because the data was quite a lot, but for this presentation, I wanted to focus on two questions really. So the first is, actually, it's one big question with 2 sub-questions. That is, what are the isiMpondo writers' experiences and views about eradicationism? So how have they experienced people trying to eradicate their particular varieties? So we're looking at 2 places mainly. In school, so this means while these writers were in school, and secondly, outside of school, in the community more generally. And then I'm going to look very briefly at what are some of the implications of what these writers were telling us for connections between how people use language and how this links with their identities, but also what are the links, possible links and implications for teaching and learning. Okay, at the top you have the extract in isiMpondo, and then at the bottom the italized bottom, that's the English translation. And in the interest of space, we've made the extracts very brief. So in relation to the question about their experiences and views of using isiMpondo while they were in school, this is some of the responses that we got. So Andile, a pseudonym, this is what he said. We didn't use much isiMpondo. When we did, people would laugh at you. You'd be regarded as uncivilized, ignorant, or uneducated. Okay, and some of the other responses from the other respondents, which we've summarized, included the following. We were not allowed to use isiMpondo. We were ridiculed for using isiMpondo. Some teachers tolerated use of isiMpondo in speech, but not in writing. And of course, this I have also found to be the case in relation with other varieties, like smaller varieties of African languages, in cases like Sesotho or isiZulu as well. So other respondents said that isiMpondo speakers policed correct use of isiXhosa, even as they spoke incorrect isiXhosa in some instances. And the other respondent said that he did not experience direct criticism using isiMpondo in school, but had to constantly clarify their speech. So they had to constantly explain what they mean when they're using certain words or certain phrases. Now, what are some of these views, opinions, observations of participants telling us? Well, so we can see that there is some linguistic erasure, or we can see that there is evidence of eradicationism in their experiences, that people attempt to eradicate their variety. We can see some experience of linguistic insecurity, where the respondents are saying that they're subjects of constant correction or hypercorrection. But also we can see linguistic domination, where the particular variety of isiMpondo that they're speaking is seen as deviant from a norm of isiXhosa that's used actually outside of their own community. But also we could see the experience of linguistic incompetence, being made to feel that you are not speaking proper language constantly. And as you can imagine, this has got many consequences for speakers. So on the question of or about the use of isiMpondo outside of school, this is what Clarissa, for example, said. And she said this quite in an exasperated manner. She says, when I speak isiMpondo, listen for isiMpondo. Don't listen for isiXhosa. I am speaking isiMpondo, not isiXhosa. You need to hear me with an isiMpondo ear rather than an isiXhosa one. And then another participant, Marva, this is what he said. People appreciate something different. Okay, this is when he speaks isiMpondo. I try not to use obscure language in order to ensure that hearers can follow what I'm saying. So what he's saying that even when he's using isiMpondo, then he tries not to use very deep isiMpondo so that people can follow what he's saying. So we can see here that in this particular case, in the case of using isiMpondo outside of school, that there are varied experiences between the participants or respondents. Okay, other respondents said that what they do, they often pretend to be either an isiXhosa or isiZulu speaker. And this makes some sense because both isiXhosa and isiZulu are official languages. They are written relative to isiMpondo, the high status. And of course, both these languages border the places where isiMpondo is spoken. isiXhosa would be to the west and isiZulu to the east. And then another respondent said, hearers sometimes associate isiMpondo with being stupid or a lack of sophistication. So then you can imagine that then people hide, again, their varieties, they suppress them, they don't use them in certain public spaces. And then another respondent said, some hearers commented that isiMpondo was strange, or novel, or interesting, or just funny. Funny as in weird. Okay, so what can we say about this? So again, we can see a clear case of hearers. This is users of other varieties of isiXhosa imposing isiXhosa norms on isiMpondo speakers. We can see some stigmatization of the speech and cultural practices of isiMpondo speakers. We can observe that some speakers of isiMpondo avoid using quote-unquote deep or unusual isiMpondo forms when they're in the company of speakers of other varieties. This is an example of a linguistic accommodation strategy in order to enable communication with others. We can also observe that some speakers of isiMpondo distance themselves from the isiMpondo language and its culture, and then this carries the danger of loss of identity. But also, in some cases, we find that some speakers, because people are interested really in their variety, they've got interest in isiMpondo, they tend to highlight isiMpondo when they're in the presence of other speakers. They tend to exaggerate isiMpondo, either pronunciation. They tend to exploit differences between isiMpondo and isiXhosa in order to promote isiMpondo language and cultural practices. And often you find these kinds of exaggerations, almost caricatures of isiMpondo in practices such as comedy or in sort of public monologues, in storytelling, but also you do find it in community radio. For example, in Ukhozi FM, based in Flagstaff. But again, I think also what we can observe is that there is a perception, at least from the participants, that there is deep and widespread interest in isiMpondo as different, as strange, by other, by speakers of other varieties of isiXhosa in the Eastern Cape, but also in the broader South African community. And this could be a reflection of a general interest in sort of cultural and linguistic diversity in South Africa, or could also be at the same time, or even alternatively, be some form of linguistic othering. I think like all these remarks that I've made here, are also applicable to quote-unquote minority varieties of English in South Africa, in particular Black South African English. it's stigmatized in certain domains. Um, um, some people feel compelled to distance from, in particular, particular pronunciations of Black English. Um, I mean, at the same time, also you find some interest, some curiosity in the strange ways in which Black people use English. Again, even in that connection, you find this sort of alternative explanations that you can take on that, whether is it sort of a genuine interest in linguistic diversity, or is it just a form of linguistic othering. So far, I think that's kind of the few remarks that I'd like to make in relation to those two questions. And I suppose to conclude, so are we seeing the end of linguistic eradicationism in relation to minority or non-standard varieties of African languages? I think the short answer appears to be no. And the other general observation we can make is that what appears to be happening is that schools appear to be more tolerant of named, established, essentially rural varieties of African languages. So they're much more tolerant of isiMpondo, isiPaca, isiHlubi, isiGalega, and so on, generally speaking, but are not necessarily open to the urban varieties of these languages. For example, varieties that would be used in places like Gauteng, the Western Cape, or Durban, or Bloemfontein, and so on, because those ones are seen probably because they're newer, but also probably because they're actually much more co-mixed with other varieties of African languages and English and Afrikaans. In some cases, they're seen essentially as broken language. Okay, but also I think the point to note is that even when schools are generally tolerant of the rural varieties in spoken language, they're generally not necessarily respectful or inclusive of these varieties in written language, or they don't even necessarily draw on them even in oral classroom language. But there seems to be also countervailing factors, sort of kind of in the positive side. There appears to be, this is across the board, not just in the case of isiMpondo, but there appears to be greater activism around marginalized varieties of African languages, greater interest. People are using them a lot more in speech, and you see them a lot more in social media. Of course, this is anecdotal. There also appears to be greater openness among language authorities. For example, in the case of the Eastern Cape, South Eastern Cape is thinking and talking about working with us to explore writing children's literature in the other varieties of xhosa in the Eastern Cape. But also in general, there is broad interest in South Africa in cultural, linguistic, and linguistic diversity. So that general support might mean that there is likely, perhaps in the future, to be more support for marginal and marginalized varieties of African languages. Thank you. And then these are some of the readings some key readings that I am studying carefully to help myself to deepen my understanding of some of these issues. Thank you.